Good afternoon. I'd like to call to order the commission meeting to study slavery and subsequent de jure and de facto racial and economic discrimination against African Americans. We're at the State Library on Broad Street. The date is May the 10th, 2023, and the meeting is at 1. The meeting is being held at 1 p.m. So I'd like to call to order, and at this time, the first agenda item that we have is for the approval of the agenda and previous meeting minutes. I hope everyone's had an opportunity to review the minutes. And if there are no revision to the minutes, I'll give you need a few moments. Those who review those, and if not, then we will I will accept a motion for the approval of the minutes.
So
It's been made and properly second for the approval of the minutes. All in favor said aye. Aye. Those that oppose, there are none. Thank you. I am so excited. I tell you, this was one of the meetings I'm excited about attending today, because I know there's been a lot of work that has been done to this point, just addressing those things that, those subject matters that we have been focused on: economics, education, healthcare, housing, justice, and equity, and voting. And so I know that today, there are, the reports will come forward in terms of where you are, as we continue to do the work that we have been commissioned to do. But I am extremely, extremely excited. At this time, I think other than any other report, we're going to ask that a project manager will give a report at this time, and then we will continue with that meeting afterwards. Thank you. Dominique, thank you for being so awesome. Thank you, darling.
Good afternoon.
I do apologize. One thing, I looked up and I saw Andre Douglas.
Yes.
Then I realized that I had not taken roll.
Yes.
So let's we'll call for the roll first.
Dr. Jody Allen,
Here.
Dr. Ed Ayers,
here.
Dr. John W. Kinney,
Here.
Delegate Dolores McClain, Chair,
Here.
Senator Mamie Locke, Vice Chair,
President.
Dr. Cassandra Newby Alexander,
Here.
Dr. Karen Sherry,
Here.
Mr. Xavier Richardson,
Here.
and then virtually, Dr. Andrea Douglas.
Thank
Thank you. So this afternoon, thank you. I won't take too much of your time. I'd just like to give a few quick remarks from the project manager standpoint. There's 3 quick points that I'd like to just mention very briefly as I refer to my notes. First is a big, wonderful thank you to all of you for participating over the last 2 weeks in the subcommittee meetings. We have held 5 public subcommittee meetings in the past 10 days, and it has been a flurry of really constructive information sharing, resource sharing, and content building as it will relate to the recommendations and to the report. So I just want to thank you all very kindly for everything that you've been doing. And if there are any amendments to the notes from each subcommittee meeting that I sent to you, please let me know. I will make those adjustments and get those notes back out. Additionally, as you move forward and continue to plan and schedule subcommittee meetings, I think we might be able to just follow the same format. Scheduling those meetings, I'm still available to do all the note taking and send those out following. Usually takes me a day or 2, so I appreciate your patience in that. But I think if that works for you, I'm happy to continue in that capacity. The second thing that Second thing that I'd like to update you on is to follow up on 2 items regarding the website. In our March meeting, there was 2 notes. One is that whether or not the website is subject to being removed. To my knowledge, the library is the or not to my knowledge, the library is the server and the host platform for the commission's website. And we have never had a request for the content to come down in the past, and we do not anticipate that to be in the future. Also, we are the state depository for lots of information, for archival records, for government records of all kinds. And so I just want to follow up, having checked here at the library and having checked with Dr. Kimball and a few others, that this is something that I wanted you to know that we did follow up on, and to come back to and let you know that we've checked on this and we do not foresee any concerns in that matter. The second website question that I'm following up on is the request of whether or not we can add a resource page to the website. We can. I double checked with our IT department, who was very kind. As we move more towards actual having those final bibliographies and lists of resources, they are already ready and prepared. A ticket has already been submitted to build out a supplemental resource page. I've let them know that it could be a few weeks to months until we're ready with those final lists of resources, but they are prepared and ready to receive that content. The third, final, more administrative point that I'll have is to follow up with you moving forward, because we have this meeting scheduled and we have a June meeting scheduled, but I did want to make sure it was on your mind that we need to schedule out the next 6 to 12 months worth of meetings. So I'll be in communication with Delegate and Mamie Locke about that. And as we move forward, we'll try to get that information to you and onto your calendars as quickly as possible. Any questions that I can answer at this time? Thank you so much. That is the end of my project manager's report.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that report. And so at this time, we're going to move expeditiously and asking that those who are that you would make the subcommittee report, where you are, where you've been, things that you have discussed, and we think we have ample time to get that done. Maybe the first subcommittee is economics. I've already taken care of it.
Right.
I said, Dr. Allen, you give that report on voting. I think it might be really good to get up at the podium, and that way the information, I know Dr. Allen really don't want to do that. However,
we have excellent minutes.
Okay.
They just said, but those are not shared with everyone that we.
No, sir, they are only between the two members of those subcommittees until you approve it going to your colleagues.
Is that a public document?
That is a great question. Technically, all records of the commission are public documents. Yes. Yes, they have that.
yes, yes, so that would be great.
Well, completely, this is like this nightmares you have where you're certainly called on to, I do have all my clothes on, so there's that.
I'll show you my tennis shoes.
Yeah. So we had a really stimulating and productive conversation of the economic subcommittee, which is Ms. Richardson and I, and having our colleagues from the library there, Greg Dominique, was really helpful as well. So it was I'd already Ms. Richardson had already been to one meeting of voting, so he already knew kind of what the shape of it was to look like. But I was not exactly clear what our subcommittee meetings would be like, and I was encouraged to see how quickly they became substantive and how quickly we came to the realization that there are a lot of people in the Commonwealth had worked for a long time to advance various kinds of efforts for greater economic equality. So we went back and thought about, called people's attention to the fact that Virginia has a special burden in this regard, being the home of the largest number of enslaved people in the United States, being the place where enslavement was really kind of invented in the British American model and for the United States. And so that when you have 200 years of slavery before the 150 years of segregation, there is such depth of wrong to be addressed. So we thought about how would you possibly pull these different pieces apart to make sense of them all. And we decided it was important to call people's attention to that it's not just enslavement, but it is Virginia's role in that, and also Virginia's role in basically being the homeland of so many of the African-American people of the whole United States who came through Virginia. So we decided that our report will tell that story, to set the scene, to explain why this is so necessary. We also decided to focus on the fact that there had been ceaseless striving among Black people, either in slavery or in segregation afterwards, and a lot of economic accomplishment as well. And decided that fostering efforts at Black entrepreneurs to help their efforts, as well as to, and Greg pointed out that the large number of Black landholders in the early 20th century has dwindled. And so focusing on the rural parts of the state that are have seen such outmigration, but there are still people who are farming, and we should support them as well. So the different contexts would be to set the scene, to acknowledge the constant striving of Black people, even in the face of slavery and segregation, and to concentrate on the people who are working to advance issues of equity. We didn't want to get in housing since that's another subcommittee, but as we're talking mainly about fostering support for people who are building their own wealth and getting behind people who are have been striving since the days of Maggie Walker to create economic futures for themselves. Mr. Richardson, does that seem like an adequate summary of what we talked about?
You did a great job.
All right. Thanks very much. Did you finish your list?
If the two of you can just hold for a second, because I do want to ask, are there any questions among our colleagues? One question that I do have, as we look at it, and I'm in January, okay? So we're trying to get to the finish part, right? And I think that, you know, when we look at the whole issue of economic security, economic vitality, and we look at the disparities that exist, and so have you thought about how those disparities would be, I guess, put forward so there's a clear understanding about, you know, we've heard a lot of things over the years. People are lazy, people don't want to do certain things. But just as there's generational wealth, Black communities have had to deal with generational poverty. And the struggle trying to get beyond that has been just a major struggle. So I don't know if y'all had an opportunity to have any of that kind of conversation.
We did, which is why we were talking about the centuries of deprivation of wealth and of just sheer labor that have taken from people. So I think there's reason, not just to call us a historian, but we decided that the historical context in which this means that by the time of emancipation, maybe 5 or 6 generations of people had everything they learned before taken from them, and then 150 years. We did think that it's important to stress that to show what you're referring to, it was not for lack of trying. Okay. You know, it was not for lack of imagination, creativity, self-sufficiency, and all those things. That even in the face of every kind of obstacle that there was, that Black families did manage to secure as much for themselves as they could. So it's important to have both those elements in the story. Yes. But I think that we will certainly document what it means to have had all these generations as well. Just elaborate.
Yes. And actually you'll see and the health one as well. We talked about disparities, and because disparities will show the present situation, the impact, the long-term impact, the present impact, and it's easy for people to understand the issues when they can see that there are these great disparities, but like the root cause of those disparities is all of these things that have happened as a result of slavery and resulting discrimination and all. So we're even talking about, as part of the way it's presented, that hopefully, I think all of the subject area, all of the areas that we're going to be looking at as a commission, we ought to be able to look at the disparities, and that shows the impact of why it's so important for us to continue to talk about it, and continue to create the situation that we're currently in.
Yeah, I think it's one opportunity of this commission to show, give people much broader understanding of where the disparities come from. Usually the stories pick up way too late in order to understand. But I think that's something, given our charge, that we can usually supply to help you bring things that broad.
Anyone else?
Yes, I was wondering, when, as you all were talking about this, did you, look at, the use of eminent domain, as a way of, impacting in a negative way, Black wealth, Black businesses especially? And I'm thinking of the fairly recent examples of the interstate systems. Even as late as now, as they're, deciding which routes to go through, and they just so happen to go through, areas that are dominated by African Americans, or placing industries, rezoning those areas and placing big industries, which, of course, have a horrible impact on health and as well as your housing, but, placing those industries right next to Black businesses, Black communities. So I was wondering if you were looking at any of that.
Or if I could add gentrification too.
Yes. I would say that you talked about displacement through the interstate highway system, but not factories and not gentrification. I think that is great. I would say that we'll want to cooperate with our friends on the housing subcommittee to figure out how we draw that, not encroach on their property. But I think that we, especially since we're talking about how do we address these wrongs to be pointed out, the cost of gentrification and displacement. I think is really important.
And I really think that the next, fight for many families, Black families. And so this is, and I'm saying this so we can make sure that there are some kind of recommendations, as we move forward. But one of the greater fights is going to be, just use the example, the airport. So much of that land is owned by Black families.
You're talking about in Richmond.
Yes.
Same thing was true in
Yes.
Northern as well.
And the part of the land also, services. They came in, and there's one person that I've spoken with, that even remember, 87 years old, remember the situation. Of them being marched out of their homes, and so, the thought is, how do we look at this? And I don't know, I know the airport is not going anywhere, and the armed services, they're not going anywhere. But the bottom line is, what was supposed to be the way of securing generational wealth was just snatched from under us. In many ways.
About both of these is state sponsored.
Yes.
And so that
That was
government. And so that it's not just something that happens in the working of the economy. So I think given that we're in a legislative body to address the role of the state creating this as a responsibility.
Yeah, I would agree. Although these presentations, of course, are in silos, that's why it's good for us to be here around the table, because there's some common thread
Yes.
at the root cause of it. And even after we do this, when we sit down, we may realize that there's more connectivity than we think. So we think that this commission will be in existence for a long, long time.
Awesome. Okay, thank you all so much. We appreciate it. Great work. Education.
Sure, with my right hand person, will be able to chime in too. No, you asked for education. I thought you were healthcare. It's hard to live. Well, a lot of education. Oh, geez, okay.
For a minute, I was ready to give the baton. So, Dr. Andrea Douglas and I met, along with Greg Kimball, to talk about, this particular topic on education and some of the things that, well, the primary focus is looking at education for African Americans in Virginia, especially, and we know that it has national implications. But we thought the first step would be to create a bibliography. There have been a number of books and articles over the past 30 years that have come out talking about these different aspects of Black education. And we wanted to make sure that the way that the bibliography, that can be huge, is organized is in concert with this timetable that we were talking about also including. Typically, historians have organized historical timetables in ways that are around American colonialism, imperialism, warfare. But we're saying that when it comes to focusing on Black agency, not just what people have done to African Americans, but rather how African Americans have sought to create their own avenues to education. So that would require that we move away from these typical constructs. So fine with the colonial period. That period is important. But looking also fine with the revolutionary and constitutional period. But once we get into the antebellum period, once we get past the Civil War and Reconstruction, now we're talking about freedom's first generation. Because that period does not fit easily. What was happening for African Americans does not fit easily into this idea of the Gilded Age or just progressivism. And typically when it comes to the way that we've constructed this period through the schools, that really is overlooked, because it's as if we end Reconstruction and then jump to the 20th century. So, you know, all of that is folded into Jim Crow, when Jim Crow actually evolved a little bit later on. And so freedom's first generation is this generation that was either born around the time of slavery, or, you know, at the end of slavery, or just after the Civil War, after the passage of the 13th Amendment. This generation went essentially from being enslaved to being professionals in so many ways. We saw a tremendous advancement that for some groups would take generations. For this group, it took one generation, and then we saw obstacles, very specific obstacles put in place, both by private as well as public entities, that would actually stop or slow down a lot of the progression. And so talking about education, Black education through that construct, we thought was really important. For example, we would see the birth of a number of Black medical schools, but you would see the medical hospital association and medical school associations that were dominated by whites work in concert with federal and state governments to change the rules of how these institutions could exist, resulting in the closing of a number of these institutions that then directly impacted the number of professionals, because most of the white medical schools refused to admit Blacks in. So it limited the number of Blacks who were able then to succeed, to go through. In addition, many of these medical schools that were Black owned did not discriminate in terms of women being admitted, whereas most of the medical schools for whites did. And so you saw a much more equitable growth in professionals in that area. And there were a whole host of other professional schools that emerged in this time period we call Freedom's First Generation, that goes into the early part of the 20th century. Then we were looking at the idea of seeing progressivism from a much more expansive period. It did not end with the First World War. It continued even through the 1930s and 40s. In fact, that's what the idea of progressivism is, what Franklin Roosevelt adopted with the New Deal program. So we're talking about changing the bibliography's organization to reflect these different time frames, and not just go into talking about the segregated schools, the integrated schools, as if that was the goal of African Americans to integrate. The goal was to have the same resources and not be restricted as to where they would go. If they chose to go to an all-Black school, that was their choice, rather than that was by force. And so kind of recasting the way that we perceive, the way that we organize, the way that we understand this time period, we thought could be reflected in the timeline, as well as, of course, in how we organize the bibliography. Again, putting the focus on Black agency. The other thing we wanted to do is to make sure that we looked at the Black schools, the private, the public, the secret, the open, all of these schools, the academies, as well as the HBCUs, and looking at all of these schools and the history of these schools is so important, and it can't be found in one location. I know that the Encyclopedia of Virginia has been doing a lot of work with that, but having a single space where you can see all of this information in this one space about the history of Black schools and the differences, and not just talking about the post-Civil War period, but also talking about the earlier period, the period in which you had, in some cases, Blacks creating schools for themselves, but whites creating schools for Blacks, and looking at what kind of schools did they have, what kind of curricula did they push forward. And that kind of gets us into the curricula changes that occurred, because a lot of people don't really understand how education has evolved. So we're suggesting including some information about how our educational system today, it was very different even around the turn of the 20th century. You could go from a normal school, which is what we call a high school or almost a two-year college, to a professional school, medical school, graduate school, or law school. You can't do that today, but you could do that in the latter part of the 19th, early 20th century. So explaining that and explaining the role of this curricula or these institutions, and how there were many people like the principal, Mr. Palmer in Newport News, who refused to change the public school curriculum, the high school curriculum, to vocational training only. He wanted the students to continue to have a liberal arts education, and he was fired as a result of that. You know, looking at how the curricula changed depending on the time period, so that we kind of move away from these very generalized perceptions of Black education, and we really, start talking about and having little blurbs about the actual history of Black education and all of its complications. And then that kind of goes into the segregation versus integration idea. A lot of books have talked about this push for integration, but it's as if there was a general agreed upon leap from segregation to integration, even within the Black community, which was not the case. And so kind of busting that myth, we thought was really important. And then finally, talking about more current things having to do with the unequal funding and how over the centuries, those things were highlighted. And I'm talking about in terms of public education, how the argument has been, well, the Black schools were funded based on their taxes, which was not entirely true. There were tax dollars taken from Black families on a regular basis, and those tax dollars were moved to white schools. And that happened for decades upon decades. And so really, there have been a number of historians that have documented that. So, really bringing out some of this material that has been put in books and kind of put into a category, like Managing Segregation by J. Douglas Smith. That's been put into a category of talking about segregated schools or integration, but that's not really what the book was about. But that's how it's been sort of categorized. So pulling all of this out in a different way to provide a much different approach to how we perceive Black education. The material is there. It's just, it hasn't been crowdsourced and it hasn't been put together in the way that we're suggesting. Are there any questions? Oh, and Andrea, did you have anything to add?
No, I think that was pretty thorough. Thank you. I think that what's exciting about this is just that this place where we're emphasizing Black agency and creating a space to really dig into what this kind of education means for the state. Even I often argue that if it were not for the desires of Black people for freedom, we would not live the way that we live today. It is those desires that drive many of the systems that try and prevent those desires. And I think the approach that we're taking will allow us to really parse that out. And then ultimately, when we're thinking about recommendations, give us a great springboard from which to make those recommendations. So thanks for that thorough presentation.
Something that and she just made me remember something that we did add, and that is the oral interviews that have been done. There have been hundreds and hundreds of oral interviews by people, some of whom are no longer with us today, talking about their experiences as in education, and having those voices be a part of this archival information, I think would be very enlightening.
Are there any questions? I'm going to bring something up and then I'm going to look at a certain person in the room. Okay. Educate, no, you don't have to go. So to education in the Black church. Because I don't see, well, this is great what you all are doing.
Well, that's part of the private
a component.
Right, that's part of the private educational systems, because you had a number of Black schools that were operating within the confines of Black churches. Interestingly, some white churches as well.
Yeah.
You had some white churches who were educating Black children, even who were enslaved, even though it was against the law. And then you had Black churches that were, in a way, secretly educating, or early on, openly, but educating Black children who were within their community, not just those in the church, and continuing to educate them. And then the churches and the schools were very involved in helping to teach, because we talked about the civics. You know, the idea of education has been the high expectation of achievement, but also educating you about your responsibilities as citizens. And so there were no degrees of separation in the community and the private sector between the church and what was happening with schools and the community in general. The first schools opened up in Virginia for African Americans was in 1863, and it was at what we call today St. John's Church in Norfolk. And then the second day they opened up another school at not Bank Street, but First Baptist Church on the historic First Baptist Church. And there's a drawing of the students sitting out the church. First day, there were, 800 or 900 students who showed up, you know, for you know, a fraction of the size that they could accommodate. And then the next day they had over 1,200 students show up. And so they were packing these two churches. And then it began to expand. And then, you know, there were other spaces. Mary Kelsey Peak sitting under the Emancipation Oak because their church had been burned down prior to that, still educating people. So we know that the church has been very important.
Yeah, very influential in that whole
I was just going to say, particularly in the case congregation where I shared, grades 1 through 12 in a one-room schoolhouse, built by the members of the church, but supported by the county's school system, as long as you would do this only for Black folk. And I guess one of the greatest mistakes I made in my leadership over the years that I did not find the resources to preserve that. That in one room, grades 1 through 12, and there's still people living and talk about how they did that. And the amazing thing for me when we talk about agency is when you consider the negativities that they confront.
Yeah.
They found to educate and to shape values in that one room, oftentimes with 1 or 2 teachers separated in one room. And that is in some ways a characteristic model around the state of Virginia, that on the church grounds, you could expect to find a building dedicated for the purposes of public education.
So I have a comment and a question. The comment is, with Virginia being represented at the United States Capitol with Barbara Johns, it calls attention even more to the, if we're not complete Commonwealth of Hypocrites, to acknowledge. Secondly, are you
doing
telling
it
me?
now, then, just kidding.
Oh, not now. Are you doing the higher ed?
Yes, and that's where the HBCUs come in. But also you had academies, and you had what they call colleges. So in the earlier system, Norfolk Mission College was an example where the National Presbyterian Church funded that college, but it was kind of like a high school. So when Norfolk took it over, it became eventually Booker T. Washington High School. But they changed the curriculum. So the curriculum was preparing people for professions and for higher levels of thinking, and they changed it to vocational training, even though the teachers continued to teach the other curricula. But usually when the state would take over, attention would be drawn to that, you would see some changes.
Generations of non-investing.
Yeah, and then you had the brief period of Virginia sending a handful of Black people out of the state.
Yeah.
But it does not take into consideration that was an unfair implementation of a law. So you can go anywhere you want if you're part of the top 1%. But if you're white, you can go anywhere you want, as long as you can get accepted.
Awesome, thank you, thank you. Okay, healthcare.
Sure.
The other healthcare.
Right. Okay. Dr. Sherry and I met for the first time, so we're not nearly as far along as the Education Committee. One of the things that we start off looking at the present situation in terms of disparities, and then trying to work back and figure out what are the root causes of those things, because that's the most easy thing to understand the impact as it is today, because some might say, is it relevant? It is relevant because we can see severe health disparities in this Commonwealth. And so we started to look at some of the examples, and we know that historically, a lot of times disparities in healthcare are attributed to socioeconomic status. Now, to a certain degree, it is, but it's related to a lot of other things, like you said, location, access to healthcare facilities. And then one of the best examples that we can probably highlight that issue is on maternal health outcomes. And in terms of the mother and in terms of the births that don't survive. And historically, people are still trying to attribute a lot of that to the socioeconomic differences. However, if you control for socioeconomics and compare different groups, you will find, like, for instance, that college-educated African-American women are 3 times as likely, or some degree of that, to have lower birth rates, successful birth rates, and more deaths. So we know that it goes beyond that. So we can't get stuck on the socioeconomics, although we know it is part of it. It has to be something else at the root cause of that. So when we start talking about some of the disparities that we would like to look at, we know that the state collects a lot of that data, and through the Department of Health, we'll be able to show, and probably show over the years, the negative impact that racial and economic discrimination against African Americans as a result of these disparities. But as we begin to talk about health and physical health, Dr. Sherry reminded us that there's also issues relative to mental health. And I really should not have needed to be reminded of that, because when we conducted our community health needs assessment in our region, something we have to do every 3 years, and did it in conjunction with the health department. Access to care, of course, is number one. The second thing was mental health, because there's a lack of resources there, and when you control for race, you can see there's an issue there. And by the way, the third one was affordable housing, because that has an impact, and certainly it shows how all these different things have an impact on one another. It's good to study in isolation, but it's good to bring it together as we're doing today. So we also talked about disparities relative to healthcare for veterans, and because that has an impact on mental health too, which then leads to homelessness, and certainly a disparate impact there. And it also, we know that we have to look at the historical things that have an impact on that too, because of the Tuskegee experiment, and then Henrietta Lacks, and so sometimes people expect that African Americans are not going to access health, and sometimes they don't. But it's not necessarily they don't want it. Sometimes it's just how the access is made available and how it's distributed. I gave the example of COVID-19. Everyone expected African Americans to be vaccinated at a lower rate. And in our community, when we were given permission to do it, we actually had our vaccination rates for African Americans commensurate with our relative share of the population. What did that mean? That meant that you had to have people out there that they trusted to convey it. It also meant that we have to provide it in a way, communicate in a way I told the story how I spent many nights up until 1 o'clock, sitting around with I call it my, no one sells Amway here, my pyramid, like Amway, where I had people who were calling me every night, sending me names and all, which had nothing to do with my job, but I was determined that we were going to prove that African Americans do want to be vaccinated. It's access issues, and we were able to do that, but we couldn't do it in the same way where you just send out and communicate in the traditional means. Okay, we put it on the radio. Well, do African Americans listen to that radio station? No. Do they read that particular newspaper? Things like that. So we talked about how we communicate as well, because that has an impact on it. And certainly the closing of hospitals, particularly in some of the rural communities. So some of the main issues and themes that we saw there was that we need a pipeline of educating and developing future healthcare workers. It was interesting what you talked about, the medical schools and closing down, that reduce the number of African American physicians, and studies will show you that sometimes that African Americans fare better when they have a physician that looks like them. And that has even been the story relative to maternal health outcomes as well. So we have to look at how we can create a pipeline of future healthcare workers and mental health care workers. That's what we're doing in our community, and making sure that the entire population has access to that. The issues with connecting with and communicating with communicating and building trust in these communities too. Again, you need to have people that community members trust, and if they don't trust you, you could be given the best information and the best resources, but nobody's gonna take it because of the historical issues and some of the present issues. If you go into hospitals and you feel you're not treated properly, and you're hearing that African American women, regardless of their ability to pay, with Serena Williams is a perfect example, that it still becomes an issue. Why is the average African American going to trust? So we need to talk about all those things that have been a result of racism and discrimination, et cetera. And some will even say some of the issues with African American women and those negative maternal conditions. One issue has been said that African American women have a capacity to endure pain because historically that's what you're saying. Yes, exactly, endure pain. And when people say, well, that doesn't make sense, but it does. If someone thinks that this is, I've had to go through this type of pain all my life, and you grow up in an environment with it, you're going to ignore perhaps some of the signs. And then when you look at what doctors, when you take some of the studies have shown that medical students have this perception that African Americans can endure pain more, and they have all these preconceived notions which have an impact on the delivery of care. So there's a lot of great things out there that we need to follow up on. You know, there's a book, Medical Apartheid, the dark history of medical experimentation on Black Americans from colonial times to the present. There's some stories about the American health dilemma beginning back into the 1900s, the NIH studies, Harvard Medical School studies. We're going to see what studies have been done here in the state, because we know UVA is doing a lot. I just happen to know that because I'm on the board there, a lot of work in the area of disparities. And we know that right here in Richmond, we're sure that there are, and there are probably some in other places as well. Yeah, and oh, you all did a great job. I wasn't at this meeting. I thank you for adding these other. They've been great team members, I tell you. They went out and found some resources for us. Thank you. Okay. And we said even in not pop culture, but even Oprah has done a documentary on what the color of healthcare or whatever, and as it relates to women, et cetera. So our recommendations, we think at this time, we're just saying if we had to come with some recommendations, we would say we'll recommend funding initiatives that help to reduce disparities and health equities, whatever they are, and throughout the community, and not assuming that every community is the same. And also try to encourage funding that will go along with work that's currently being done in communities right now to enhance that delivery of work with some of the foundations that are currently funding healthcare foundations that are funding these things. We also talked about improving lines of communications on various physical and mental health issues, because educating the community and having the right people educating them will hopefully reduce some of these disparities as well. So, and lastly, we said rather than sponsoring something, I talked for a second and realized I was thinking out loud that perhaps do we need to convene a round table or a town hall or something on these topics, when in fact we probably don't need to do it because they're already being done all over the state. So what we need to do is become more aware of it and partake of some of those things. What else, Jure? What else did we do?
I think maybe just to kind of recap, Mr. Richardson did a great job of summarizing many of the topics we talked about, but I think we envisioned the format of our report being similar to the other subcommittees, where we'll outline the history, then identify the key components of present day inequalities, and then make suggestions and recommendations for how to redress some of these disparities.
Thank you. So, any questions?
Yes.
So, comment, you were talking about looking at the health disparities and the causes of them. And I would recommend you all taking a look at the University of Richmond's project Mapping Inequality, as well as the Living Apart project that's being done by Johnny Finn at CNU, where they looked at the, especially the homeowners loan corporation maps from 1940. They've overlaid that with EPA data, with some health, the Department of Health data. And what they see are the but the structural issues that are creating higher levels of health challenges for African Americans. Specifically looking at high asthma rates. One community in Hampton Roads has 20 carcinogenic producing entities within a 1 mile radius of their neighborhoods. 20. And Norfolk State has 15. So it's being surrounded, and ODU has 0. So just the stark differences. And those things were put into place in some cases decades ago, but they haven't been removed. They haven't been remediated in any way. And so those are actual direct connections. You can see higher rates of cancer. You can see higher rates of high blood pressure because of the stress of living there. You see less tree canopy, which is producing higher energy rates. So this impacts a person's pocketbook because they're paying more to cool their homes down. Less tree canopy, more, more concrete around their homes. And all this has a very negative impact on health.
Thank you for articulating something that I felt all my life. I grew up 2 blocks from an FMC plant, and you could just smell the odor. And so many people in our block have died from cancer at an early age. And of course, we don't have the benefit of great academics. Well, we do have one college in Fredericksburg, but it's good to hear that other places, UVA, have done some stuff like that as well, where we can benefit from those studies and call for something more on a statewide effort.
They've even found that in one location, the average life expectancy is 61, and a mile away is 85. And in some cases, not even that great of a distance.
Yeah, that's good. But and that is existing stuff, so we'll make sure we look into all that.
Yeah, and I think it's
I'm sorry.
so I was gonna say, I think it's a place where our work on the healthcare committee will intersect with the work. of the
Exactly.
housing.
Go right on. Go ahead.
This semester, I taught a class called The Miseducation of America. And I knew about healthcare disparities, but one of the things I was surprised, one of the students, her brother is just finishing medical school. And in a textbook that he just finished using, there is a statement in there about Blacks stopping bleeding faster than whites. And he pointed it out to the professor that this was in the book that the class is currently using. And so the professor made an announcement that, oh, well, that's inaccurate. But the problem is, the book is still out there. So anyway, it's still not
Right.
even just in the hospitals, but what they're learning now. There probably needs to be an audit of textbooks even.
That's a good point.
Well, over the years, and actually, since I was in the General Assembly, I got a large population of family members that live in Charlottesville on both sides, my family side and my husband's side of the family. But people were dying of these rare cancer diseases, like something's got to be going on in Charlottesville. And I talked with folks over at MCD and just had some conversations with them, and I think it sort of, another cycle, but you still have these very rare cancers that young people were losing their lives at the whole time. And I've just recently found out that MCD, they're doing a study. I don't know where the study is now, but it may be something worth looking into. In particular, you have just such a large population of African Americans and Indian community being living there and generations of them. So that may be a good resource if you look at the healthcare piece as well, to document or to say about some of these places that we have been pushed to, on the outskirts, Eastern Henrico, Eastern, part of the city of Richmond and those areas that you find often the longevity is not as long as you would want it. So.
Yeah, and goes back to what is it? What
Yes.
is
Yeah, exactly.
what is your what is something about your zip code? What is it? Determines so much of your education, your wealth, your health, and everything else. And some of these things that we're talking about, probably the data, I think it was probably readily available. Just no one has analyzed it to the point of this, because all they have to do is heat maps and show where people are with certain health conditions, which I think is probably available statewide. It's just that no one's really taking the time like these institutions are to analyze the data to get to the root cause of it.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Great, thank you.
Okay, we're moving right along. Housing,
Well, I can tell you that we have not met.
okay, all right.
I tell you that we have not met, and I've been recovered from surgery and still dealing with the bacteria in me that I have to
Yes.
get rid of in this process. And, a few more weeks for it. But one of the things that's clear on our conversation today, and it's been noted almost by every committee, that there's a level of intersectionality and convergence with all of these, particularly when it comes to housing. Because with the housing, it's not only about housing, it's about the social realities that emerge and are incubated and in a kind of constructed housing situation that leads to the emergence of these realities. And then take a present lens of interpretation and demonize the community without addressing the historical variables that have led to the reality that exists. And so many of these things with the housing. And one of the things that does grieve me, been looking a lot just with the housing questions that are coming up right here in the Richmond area, is that sometimes it appears that the resolution for housing is abandonment of the community until another population wants that space. And so, we have a lot of challenges in those areas, but I can't imagine us looking at these without looking at what you just raised with healthcare, economics, that we're at some point, all of these are going, to converge. And I know, that, our project team over here will be calling us to a level of accountability with, already, a repository of resources that will be at our disposal. So I would just read that, and, Madam Chair, thank you for sending that expression to me when you learned.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for being here. I mean, it's just, you know, we've been praying and we thank God that you were.
But I may, start what Dr. said, I may have to give you, you may be on antibiotics for the rest of your life. Keep this bacteria that's in your system from overtaking this. Don't know how it got there, but it's there. And understand it all.
And you're here. That's the part right there. And I know what I know that you believe, and I know other people that believe, and so who report shall we believe? But anyway, we don't got it. So thank you. In terms of justice and equity, it is a very interesting subject matter right now, so I guess
Talk about equity, right?
interesting word these days.
And we talked about it. Okay, one of the first things we did was change the name of our subcommittee to Justice and Legal Equity.
Okay.
And we talked about a lot of stuff. We address issues of anti-wokeism, and you don't want me to get into it. That includes the exclusion of Black people from history, and we discussed the criminal justice system, poverty, and the enforcement of laws. We talked about the need for diversity, equity, and inclusion, particularly the removal of racial imbalance from the justice system. And we talked about the state built and enforced the system, making it imperative to change not just the law, but also those tasked with its enforcement. We went over any number of topics, particularly how anti-wokeism addresses not using equity, but focusing on opportunity, but you can't have opportunity without having equity. And trying to exclude Black people from history is a battle. But we have to ensure inclusion. We cannot allow our story to be not told. Trying to get people to understand that inclusion is not a bad thing. And that we're the ones who have to be able to do that. Courts are theaters in which justice is demonstrated. And until emancipation, Black people were cut from that system. We have to review Virginia's policies as it relates to African Americans and look at what reforms have been made and what reforms have been rolled back. Some committees have previously gone through the Virginia Code and pulled out anything that's related to race. Delegate McQuinn, you remember when we went through the whole process of looking at the code? And pulling out all of those things, going back to when some things were codified in the code as related to race and racism, and pulled all of those things out. So we have to deal with the whole concept of equal justice before the law. And we also talked about the fact that it's not always the law that needs to be changed. Often it's those who are enforcing the law that tend to be problematic. And so we talked about some of the things that we've already done as it relates to that. So since it's people who sometimes may be the problem, we can't legislate people to do the right thing. But we have legislation that's in place. We've passed clean slate legislation. We've done ban the box. We've talked about expunging records. So we should begin with the first laws around Black citizens and illustrate it's time for us to start addressing those issues. So we did come up with some recommendations. We should continue the work that the General Assembly has already done to remove marks of discrimination that were in the Virginia Code. We've already done that work, and we need to continue that work. We can educate individuals at every level of law enforcement and educate individuals about their rights. How many people really know what we did back in 2020 to reform criminal justice? And what's in that criminal justice, in those criminal justice changes? We doubt very seriously that very many people know what was done in those laws about banning chokeholds and no-knock warrants and everything that we did in those multiple laws and people not being able, law enforcement not being able to stand around and watch somebody be killed and so forth and so on. How many people actually know what was actually done? So we think this is maybe the responsibility of us out of this commission to actually educate people about those things. And we can support organizations already working on pathways of innovation, reentry, and reemployment to also get the information out and get the word out about not only what we're doing, but also what they're doing. And so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can work in concert with other organizations to also make sure that we are involved in diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's it now.
You want to add to it? Any questions? Any comments?
One comment I would just make is even because I was even thinking about this, that oftentimes you have to look at the problem, the inequities, the deprivations, the disenfranchisement. But I'm always stand amazed at the creative, constructive energy of the folk who were living in these realities, but still found a way to thrive in the midst of it. And at some point, I feel compelled not to just catalog the side that indicates the problem, but to affirm those who so courageously constructed, and for many of us are the beneficiaries of their investment.
It is, and I'm hoping in terms of, starting at a place and certainly the fact that, what is the good, bad, and the ugly, but I want to the bad, the ugly, then the good. Because it is, I'm just like you are, and I know all of us are just amazed at the progress African Americans have made, even though there's so many who are still left behind. But we've made progress, we've made advances, and so many of us, I'm just talking about African Americans, reach back to pull others along. Those who may be moving a little bit slower.
Right.
So I think all of that need to be certainly elevated in terms of, we didn't just stop, we weren't annihilated. I mean, you tried to, but that was not, the outcome was we still are right.
You might be the nostalgia just growing old. I had a very, very poor house when I grew up. I had a blessed home, in spite of the house that I had to live through. But I thank God for the home that community gave me, and the house and what absolutely.
the same thing you said about
Right.
education, we'll talk about
Yeah.
separate being unequal, well, to me, it was, unequal because we had a problem for superior support. Inside, though, we had inferior buildings, but they were all of everything.
We had, and I'm like you, the home that, it was 12, I was one of 12. One of 12. And my mom and dad, I still just can't even, imagine how they were able to make it and push us through and get us through and people are in jail and they're not, it's just all of everything. But the thing about it is, what I've understood, and I hope this is reflected in all of these reports, and we still have one more to get to, that the village also have to raise us. The church was within walking distance, and the community, a little 3-street community called Bungalow City, down off of 9 Mile Road, another one, 2 streets, Fair Oaks, and those Black communities had a conspiracy to make sure that young people would grow up, develop, and be productive. It was just, amazing. And so it's just the family and as well as that village that we live in was just a blessing. Okay, don't put up, and I'll be getting sentimental and then start crying. So I don't want to.
Might say one word, it's not why we changed the name of our subcommittee, because equity is about everything. Right?
Yes.
And so we thought, talk about it, criminal justice, equal justice. So
Yes.
it's not my theory, let's do it, but a sense of what you all are saying, these are the big themes for the whole thing. And we thought for sure was fine.
Because you and like your genius. Okay. All right, voting, and with Steve, Dr. Ali will come forth and give us the presentation of it.
Okay. So Delegate McQuinn and I are the voting committee. And we had our amazing note taker, because we talked a lot, and I feel like we solved a lot of problems, but I didn't take good notes, but Dominique did. So we have the answers, but we're looking at looking at voting in Virginia, the historic period and currently. And so when I say historic, we're talking about, African-American men voted during Reconstruction. They and they were active participants when they had the opportunity. And then all of the, once Reconstruction ends, of course, there's a concerted effort to kind of put them back in the can, and to keep them from voting. So those laws, that the Anderson-McCormick law, the Walton election bill, those efforts to, and all of the other shenanigans that people pulled that weren't necessarily laws, but they were activities that people did to keep Black men from being able to get to the polls and to have their votes count. And also the current issues with voting. So which aren't all that old, aren't necessarily old either, redistricting to do things, changing voting locations kind of at the last minute. I guess, so that would be like the restriction of voting, the resistance to restoration of voting rights for people who served their time or lost it in other ways. And excuses for current day voting fraud. So that's kind of the historic and the current issues. And so the answer we came down to came down to education, right? That people need to understand why it's important to vote, that you can't just vote every 4 years. You need to vote for the town commissioner, the county board of supervisors. You need to vote every opportunity you get to vote, because every vote does count. And if you're not participating in it at some level, then things can happen beyond your control. And so you need to participate every opportunity you get. And we need to educate, starting with like elementary school kids, you know, and moving up to say in high school where you would have kind of mock government opportunities where you could have students become delegates, and they would learn how the state government works. And so all of this to again, to educate, to get people to understand that this is important and why it's important. And one of the things that's happened is we've been convinced, or some people have been convinced, that your vote doesn't count. And when you believe that your vote doesn't count, you don't go out to do it. And why does voting have to be this restricted opportunity? You know, like that you have people who work hourly jobs. They may get a half hour for lunch, even if they're willing to take that time to try to get to their polling place. If the polling lines are so long that they stand there and they still don't get an opportunity to vote, the next time you're going to think, well, I'm just going to stay home, or I'm going to stay at my job, or I'm not going to get docked. Why don't we allow people to have that time to vote? Why is it so important that their vote is restricted? And I think we know why that happens. And so that's one of the things we need to erase. Everyone should have a truly equal opportunity to vote. And if we're living in a time where there's more technology, of course, than there's ever been. And so why aren't we being able to use that technology to open up this opportunity to people? So we have all the answers, and we will, get them down in nice and neat order, because Dominique will help us. So anyway, so that's our report. Delegate McQuinn,
I think
anything?
you did a great job in terms of sharing some of the things that we discussed. One thing that, in the things we have met that I thought about was, if there's a way to look at the history in terms of the enthusiasm level that was in the Black community to get to the poll to vote versus the apathy that exists now. How did it happen? Why did it happen? What was the cause of it? And I think that if there's, a way that we could, I guess, glean in on that kind of information and then be a part of it, I think that's good. As I tell people talk about voting fraud, and I don't know where that's coming from, because that is almost non-existent in the state. Maybe 2-3 people that found, just wrong address or something. I don't know, but it wasn't like a voting fraud. And then I shared with some of my colleagues who, claimed they're voting fraud, that I have not seen this influx of folks running to the polls to vote, okay? So that is just fabricated in terms of, particularly as it relates to African. We are begging them to get to the poll and vote, okay? We are doing everything in our power to encourage and motivate and inspire people, from the churches, to the community, to the civic association. Voting, you need to go to the poll and vote, on such and such day. But there's an apathy that has changed. It's been from the enthusiasm that used to exist for voting versus where we are now.
I'd like to piggyback on part of what you're saying. It would be good, I think, if your subcommittee looked at the educational system, because it was in the, I think, 1980s that the curriculum began to change, and it basically excised all information about state and local elections and voting, and also just voting for Congress people and senators at the federal level, and began to focus almost exclusive attention on the presidential election and the electoral college. When you do that, you send a very decided message that your vote doesn't count. And when they adopted that into the SROs, I think it really began to change the way that many people, especially going to public schools, have perceived voting. And unless you have something energizing, like when President Obama first ran, but then people saw voting as a consumer activity, not as a civic responsibility. So you might want to look at that, because I know that there have been studies done on looking at how the educational system has miseducated large swaths of the population about voting.
Yeah, we actually, I didn't mention it, but we talked about the missing civics education, you know, how that was taken out. So yeah, that.
And this emphasis on patriotism is also problematic because it has a suggestive tone to it. That is almost a white supremacist tone. And patriotism is important, but it's the civic education that should drive, not the emotion. Because patriotism is an emotional response to feelings of pride in one's country.
But I think even with patriotism, we're gonna have to recapture the narrative in terms of what patriotism is all about, right? Because what we have seen are red, white, and blue flags with tattoos over their faces and guns and marketing and I mean, it's just, and this is what's supposed to be, you know, I guess the visual of what patriotism is all about. So that is, you know, as we talk about it, I think that's a great, it needs to be included in the report, but it also need to be, in terms of education, we need to understand really what patriotism is all about. Yeah.
And just one more comment, and that is, if you're looking at the history of voting and the obstacles that have been put into place, I think it's important to focus on some of the obstacles, because some of the same obstacles you see today existed 40 years ago. And so these aren't new techniques. They're just, you know, they're just dusting them off and putting them back in place.
Thank you. You guys have been awesome. Thank you so much. We're going to move right along, the work that you're doing, and I know Dominique has been on, she's been on the front line making it happen. Thank you so much. Okay, we appreciate that. Okay, is anything else, Dominique, that you want to add to the discussion? And I think we're at the place for discussion updates from commissioners. I guess at this time, if there's anything that you all know that we need to be going on, that you want people to be a part of, or you want to share with us, that certainly is something that's great. Right now, the only thing I can think of is there are many Juneteenth activities that are coming up. Are we having a meeting before the Juneteenth? Or will we have a meeting before Juneteenth activities?
No, ma'am.
We will not.
It's after.
Oh,
About a week and a half. 2 weeks back.
Well, maybe we can collect the information and let people, if they would just kind of, those of us who are around the table, share with Dominique what's going on. We can collect that information and then just make it very much aware of what's happening across the Commonwealth in various places, the things that you all may be participating in, so that we could be a support to any of you. Okay. At this time, we're going to ask for public comment. I didn't even know we had
I have a comment. Can I speak from here?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, cool.
If you could stand up.
I will.
Appreciate that. Now, will her comments be on recorded?
For public comment. Would you mind coming to the podium? That way we'll make sure to get your comment captured.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thanks to the committee for meeting today regarding the trauma and debt owed to me and my family and my ancestors. I wanted to reiterate that the repair needs to be for a specific community of a specific lineage, the descendants of enslaved Blacks in the United States of America, here in Virginia. The term African American can be co-opted by other Blacks living in America because everyone cites their origins as Africa. I think that if the commission could make sure that the language is specific to my lineage, that would eliminate any confusion on who the commission is seeking to repair and would ensure that all debts are paid to the appropriate parties. After listening to the commission today and at the last meeting, I find that as long as the proposal includes an appropriate direct cash payment compensation, in addition to restitution, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and guarantees of non-repetition, we can definitely move forward as a state and eventually as other states make their recommendations as the nation. I don't know if a question is warranted, but I had one. If the commission would be making any federal recommendations, as member Ayers spoke about earlier, slavery in the country got its legs here in Virginia, which means that the whole country wouldn't be the same if Virginia hadn't enacted that terror on the community. I think it might be Virginia's responsibility as a state to make a recommendation federally, but also, to just take that into consideration. One point about information, member Richardson was speaking about access and communication, and I think it was a wonderful point because without information, how can people know what's going on? If the commission could take care to post information in multiple areas, and possibly in advance, like more than the week of, then people will know what's going on and can make a better attempt at being here. It was kind of a hassle to get here. I live in Norfolk, but it is important, so that's why I'm here. I have 2 more points and then I'll be done. A point about voting. The Black community isn't going to vote unless there's something to vote for. Member Newby was speaking about consumerism aspect, but the quid pro quo aspect is what happens for every other community. We get told to vote now and they'll pay later, but our ancestors got told to not vote and then they were murdered just for existing. So we get told that our ancestors died for the right to vote when really they were murdered for being Black, which kind of goes back into the reparations obstacle of it all. And I think that the current dual party system is kind of confusing because the Democrats used to be Republicans, but now they're the group that has self-proclaimed themselves as our party, but they aren't doing anything for the people that they're claiming to represent. Think sanctuary cities and programs for people who aren't even supposed to be here. I hope the subcommittee addresses that in their reporting. My final point is that California has been a great example for the country regarding the trauma and terror that has been enacted on my lineage, and the studies will prove that more studies need to happen. But what needs to happen is that compensation and resources need to be agreed upon first, and that needs to be paid out first, that repair can start. If it could take years for certain programs to get their legs, hospitals take years to be built, schools take years to, find all the people who are going to staff these places. And I think that if your official recommendation could include that the highlight for the need of immediate distribution of resources and allotment of funds while the other programs get their kinks worked out, that would be appreciated. Thank you for allowing my comment.
Okay, thank you. Did you share with us your name?
Oh, Eve. From Norfolk. Eve.
Eve? Okay. Eve, thank you for coming. Appreciate your remarks. I don't know if anybody had anything to respond. All right. We have someone else? Okay, all right. Good afternoon. You say it at the mic and that way we'll have it on record.
Okay. Good afternoon to the committee. My name is Melissa Williams. I am from Portsmouth, Virginia. I'm also a graduate of the illustrious Norfolk State University, and I am a Navy veteran. Couple of things I do want to, I share the same sentiments as Eve as far as the who, making it lineage based and expressing some form of cash payment redress, in addition to a couple of the other things she said. Might I also make a recommendation? I hear when the subcommittees were speaking, they were talking about the areas that they wanted to address. First, I'll start with the healthcare subcommittee. Might I recommend that you add something in your report about food deserts? Because where I live, there are a plethora of food deserts. We live in an area where on every other corner, there's a fast food restaurant. There are no farmers markets. We have to drive about 45 minutes to an hour to get to the nearest Whole Food store. And we live in places where we can't really try to grow our own food because the soil around where we live is contaminated or either tainted. So if you could add something about food deserts in your report. Also, the healthcare subcommittee. I'm not sure if you all might have read this, but I would like to recommend Dr. Mary Washington's Medical Apartheid. That book has a really, really excellent breakdown of medical malpractice towards Black Americans. And the Housing Committee, I would like to recommend The Color of Law. That book has a really, really great breakdown of redlining and gentrification. To the Voting Committee, I do express the same sentiments as Eve, so I don't want to get up here and sound like a broken record. She said a lot of the things that I wanted to say, but I would also like to say, for my generation as a millennial, we do understand that voting is important. However, we have been told to just show up and vote, but we don't receive anything tangible for our vote. There are different ethnic groups in the United States of America who don't even turn out in numbers that we do. And they have specific tangibles and set-asides for their ethnic group, and they're not told to show up in numbers that we are, and they're not pandered to. There is a lot of pandering that has been going on towards Black Americans as far as wanting us to just be there just to vote and not receive anything in return for our vote. So our generation does kind of look at it a little differently, because we've been seeing the domino effect from like our older generations who have been getting out there, you know, risking their lives and sometimes losing their lives just to show up to turn out to vote, and in the end getting nothing in return for it. So that could also be something to think about in your voting report. If there was one more thing that I wanted to, I think that, no, I think that's it. Thank you for allowing me to speak today, and I'll be looking forward to the next hearing that you all have.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Okay, all right, then that ends this meeting for the Commission to Study Slavery and subsequent review and de facto racial and economic discrimination against African Americans. And so if there's no other comment, at this moment, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you all. Sorry. Okay, I'm sorry, so it's unadjourned.
I apologize, can you please call for a motion?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Okay, could I have a motion to be made to adjourn? So, okay, the motion been made and properly second, all in favor say aye. Anybody who desires to stay here, you can do that. At this point, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you all so much. Really appreciate all the input.
Yeah.
And I forgot, thank you to the library. Got new technology that makes the Zoom a lot. Yeah, I see everybody. And they're got all of
Keep walking up there.
Yeah.